My name is Lori Eargle. I met my husband, Ray Williamson, in 1993 at Tropical Heat Wave Music Festival in Ybor City, the then annual fundraiser for WMNF, Tampa's Community Radio. In 2001, I stunned him when I suggested we go to church. First, I proposed we try Unity, and then later, UUC. I knew of UUC because I had attended many WMNF concerts at the Octagram. I also had friends who participated in and spoke enthusiastically about the singles group. I suggested Ray and I go there, despite UUC being more than 20 miles away. UUC felt like a spiritual home as soon as I walked in. Fred Seidel and his band were singing labor songs. Reverend Abi Janamachi had just returned from his first summer sabbatical, and he delivered an inspiring sermon about labor rights. Everyone was so friendly and welcoming. A week later, the Twin Towers fell. Abi's reflections at a special evening service to help us cope with the horror of 9/11 brought comfort and reassurance. Despite expecting that Reverend Abi would leave UUC at some point for a more prominent position among UUs, when he announced the departure, I felt bereft, if unsurprised. I think many in the congregation, were happy for his advancement and sad that he would no longer be among us. We celebrated his move to a much larger congregation in an influential part of the United States, the Washington, D.C. area. In the transition from Abi's departure to now, I have learned several lessons. One is that serving on the Board of Trustees is huge and has sometimes been an unappreciated commitment. This is in part because each board member takes on many tasks, such as interfacing with various committees and performing ad hoc responsibilities, in addition to the monthly board meetings. In 2020, a multiplicity of burdens landed on the Board of Trustees. In addition, UUC reeled from one challenge to another: ministerial and staff changes, antipathy to the board, and a pandemic. I felt shocked and disheartened by what I considered to be behavior that was out of covenant and antithetical to our principles by members and non-members toward the board, including caustic, even vitriolic comments via email, conversations, and social media. As the months wore on and further controversy erupted, I found myself considering leaving UUC, as, unfortunately, a number of people had already done. I repeatedly thought about what could keep me here. What stopped me from taking that step was reviewing the richness of my experience during my 20 years tenure here and the personal growth I have had because of it. I've found longtime friends here. I've grown somewhat more comfortable speaking in public since a dear departed member, Norm Peterson, reassured me many years ago that this is the most accepting audience I could find. I've stretched myself through teaching the Welcoming Congregation course, through the beloved Conversations in-person course, and the online course within. I learned to examine my white privilege thoughts and behavior. The justice work UUC does is especially meaningful to me. The activities I do through FAST, are teaching me how to build power so we can take direct action, not just provide charity through donations. If you do not know what FAST is and does, please ask Linda Stoller or me after the service. Now, with a new faith in our congregation growing through our transitional work, I am serving as secretary on the Board of Trustees, learning more about the administrative side of our faith community and more about leadership in general and at UUC in particular. I have seen how our adoption of Zoom enables people with various health challenges, working people with tight schedules, families, members and friends who are out of town, and others to attend services, participate in and volunteer for events, and connect with one another. The breakout rooms have given us the opportunity to get to know more people after the service than we did in the social hall. What I have found through conversations with visitors is that Zoom has enabled those with trepidation to visit UUC in person to Zoom in as a first step. The book Turning Point and our discussions about it have shifted my thinking about how we grow ourselves and UUC as a faith community. While the phrase Trinity of Errors stings, the essayists make a clear case for scrutinizing our interactions with one another, visitors, and people of other faiths. They encourage us to evaluate our own points of view and determine how we want to create a beloved community here at UUC. Our social justice activities are a real opportunity to live these values. In the Turning Point essay, A Story of Imagination, Reverend David Stringer describes the benefits of their collaboration with their sister organization to FAST, which is called Amos. He says, "We were focusing more on the gifts of new relationships than the challenges. We were trusting that we could learn from and create positive change with people of other faiths, even when the rituals and language of those faiths made some of us uncomfortable. Finally, I've arrived at the conviction that putting the covenant of right relations at the center of our congregational life is critical to the health of UUC. Renewing it, reviewing it, reading it aloud together, and discussing it often will help us, I believe, to create a new sense of community. I have a deep desire for more people in UUC and our wider community to benefit from the richness I have experienced here, and hope that each of you finds that enrichment here that I have found. Thank you.
When Humpty Dumpty fell from the wall, his life was never the same again. But as Kelly reminded us in the story that she read, life transitions lead to growth. That's what I believe is happening here at Unitarian Universalists of Clearwater. We've been through a huge transition as a society since the start of the COVID pandemic, and we've been through a big transition as a congregation during a time period that roughly coincides with the pandemic. These two have sort of coalesced in my mind as one transition from which I have learned several valuable lessons about relationships, about community, and about change. Do you remember mid-March 2020? I do, vividly. It was on a Friday afternoon in mid-March, and I was still working as a news reporter. although I'm retired now. I was working at the time. When I showed up for a news interview, they wouldn't let me in to interview the executive I was going to talk to until they took my temperature, made me put on a mask, and seated me 6 feet away from the person I was going to talk to. Just a couple days earlier, the World Health Organization had declared COVID-19 a global pandemic, and I, along with everyone else, was getting a real taste of what that meant. We began to work from home, in fact, do just about everything from home, and that became the norm. We learned new terminology, like social distancing and pivoting, and of course, new technology as well. Here at UUC, our Board of Trustees quickly pivoted, canceling Sunday worship for one Sunday. Then we tried a Facebook Live broadcast, and then we went to Zoom. We've stuck with Zoom even after returning to in-person worship in the past few months. Now, admittedly, our Zoom broadcasts initially were a little rocky. There were unexpected power outages, ups and downs in sound. Sometimes there was no sound at all. "You're muted" became a very common expression. But those Zoom broadcasts have kept us together. When we added Zoom breakout rooms, the small groups where we could catch up with each other for 20 minutes or so after the worship service ended, virtually sharing a cup of coffee and good company, some people even showed up just for the social hour. And that's a really important lesson that I've learned from transition. Relationship takes precedent here at UUC and in Unitarian Universalism. Our goal has never been perfect Zoom broadcasts. Our goal is connection. We get by with a little help from our friends, as our prelude said, and we have figured out a way to see each other's faces in each other's eyes, and, as the hymn says, have our hearts be in a holy place. As I mentioned, until recently, I was a news reporter. When I was working, one of my regular assignments was to cover the Pinellas County Commission. Shortly after the pandemic began, the County Commission enacted a mask mandate. Well, it didn't take too long for the critics to emerge. The public comment portion of the commission meeting began to be dominated by people who demanded their freedom by not being forced to wear a mask. Almost nobody spoke in public about the transmissibility of COVID and the need for small, individual sacrifices to benefit the broader community. In the public arena, there was, and there continues to be, a lot of focus on individualism. How does the pandemic impact me? And almost none on community, or how does it affect the collective we? There's almost no public recognition of what we know as our seventh principle, that we are all connected. I am proud that here at UUC, when we did determine it would be safe to gather again in person, we did so with community in mind. We recognize that we're only as strong as the most vulnerable among us, and so we developed safety guidelines that centered their concerns. People who are immunocompromised or have other health challenges, or come in frequent contact with children before vaccines became available for them. A handful of people have questioned the need for those safety guidelines, including wearing masks. But those questions often abate once they understand that wearing a mask is how we care for each other. It's how we practice love. That's another powerful lesson learned. Here at UUC, we are rooted in love, and love guides the decisions we make. The COVID pandemic and our response to it meant big changes for UUC, but they were not the only transitions we faced in the past 2.5 years, as Lori said. We relied on lay leadership for a few months after the departure of Reverend Patrice Curtis and just before the pandemic began. Then we contracted with Reverend David Franks and later with Reverend Roberta Finkelstein and with Meredith Olson for professional religious leadership. I learned a lot from all of them, much more than I can begin to describe now, but I want to single out one lesson from our transitional leaders that really stands out, and that is about the nature of change. Change happens all the time. There would have been changes even if Reverend Patrice had stayed, even if Reverend Abby before her had stayed, even if the COVID pandemic had not occurred. And that's okay, because change is key to Unitarian Universalist theology. James Luther Adams, who's considered one of the most influential UU ministers and the author of Guiding Principles for a Free Faith, or The Five Smooth Stones of Liberal Religion, wrote, "Religious liberalism depends on the principle that revelation is not sealed and is continuous. In other words, our religious tradition is a living tradition because we are always learning new truths. Continual learning involves being open to change, and change is hard. Any system, including our congregation, will fight against change. Informal or formal ways of doing things, such as bylaws and policies, get baked into the system to maintain status quo. Change doesn't happen until that status quo becomes painfully uncomfortable, when the pain of things staying the same is greater than the effort of developing new habits by shifting our thinking or our lifestyle. We've gone through some painful times with staff and member resignations, broken covenant, and conflict. The pain was one reason we have decided to transition again and to hire Reverend Amy as our developmental minister. Reverend Amy will guide us as we do the work of change, specifically 4 developmental goals that we've said we want to work on over the next 4 to 7 years. Creating a culture of mutual trust between the congregation, lay leadership, staff, and ministers. Strengthening our ability to have healthy disagreements that deepen relationships. Moving from an I church to a we church, balancing individual needs with beloved community. And creating a congregation of encompassing hospitality, prompting multifaceted growth at UUC. Now, Reverend Amy will not and cannot do this work for us. We have to do it for ourselves. That's not just the members of our Board of Trustees. It's not just the longtime members. It's not just the new-time members. It's not committee chairs. It's not any one individual. Each and every person must commit to this work for UUC to become the inclusive religious community that we envision. It will not be easy. Most people in this congregation have said they want to attract new members and grow our membership. So I'm going to ask you, are you willing to do what it takes to widen our circle, to put your own comfort aside and learn new ways of being together that might seem uncomfortable to you? If we can do that, and we can do that with grace and with authenticity, then we'll not only grow our membership numbers, we'll grow ourselves, our own souls, our own spirits. One more thing to think about. Not only is UUC in the midst of a transition, so is our Unitarian Universalist Association, our broader faith. The principles that many of us say attracted us to Unitarian Universalism now are the subject of review, potentially even being rewritten. The way our UUA conducts business at General Assembly has changed, with less focus on parliamentary procedure and more emphasis on consensus and connection. Current and past UUA leaders are outspoken about using the language of faith and religion. And the current UUA president, Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, has propelled Unitarian Universalism into the national spotlight as she works to give liberal religion a prominent voice in public discourse. That's a lot of change going on. But another of James Luther Adams' 5 smooth stones gives us hope. He wrote that resources are available, both human and divine, that can help bring about the change that we seek. We have the physical and mental capacities to learn new ways of being. And that's perhaps the best lesson I've learned from transition. The people I see in front of me, the people who are on Zoom, everyone who calls UUC their spiritual home are just like Humpty Dumpty, resilient, hopeful, and loving people who are not afraid to give it another try after difficult times because we know together we make a difference in the world.